Hello, and welcome back to our journey through Revelation. We have covered a lot of ground over the last 7 weeks, and this week is no exception. We're going to be diving into Revelation 12 and 13 this week. Last week, we read through the interlude between the 6th and 7th trumpets, and then we talked about the two witnesses, and then we watched as the angel blew the 7th trumpet. And then this week, we are diving into some very interesting things. There's going to be a woman and a dragon and some beasts, and things are about to get crazy. But in all seriousness, Revelation 12 begins a new vision, and it really does go into more detail on this conflict between the church and the world, or we could say even the forces of evil. And we're going to see that portrayed in very vivid imagery as we read today. And this section it really does start the beginning of kind of the second half of the book. And we're going to see the devil emerge as a key player here in a more overt way than we have previously. And we're going to see all sorts of visions and images, and we're going to talk about them as we dive into this section. Another key theme that we're going to see in this section of Revelation, in addition to this more detail on the conflict between the church and the world, is an emphasis on what happens to the believers during this church age, during this time of the end. And we've been working off of this timeline that begins with Jesus' resurrection and his ascension and ends with his second coming when he comes back again. And one of the things we're going to see is how God protects his people from Satan and all of his minions during this time. And it is because of Christ's victory that God is able to protect his people. So let's go ahead and dive on into Revelation 12. We're going to be talking about 12 and 13 today, and there are so many things to talk about as we dive in. And so let's just start right here. So John sees a new vision, and this vision is of a woman and of a dragon. And so we have the woman, and she is described she appears in heaven, and she's clothed with the sun, the moon, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. And if that sounds a little familiar to you, it should. Often, this imagery of the sun and the moon and the stars is associated with Jacob and his wife and their offspring. And if you remember from Genesis 37, Joseph has a dream, and the sun and the moon and the stars bow down to him. And so often in the Old Testament, this imagery of the sun and the moon and the stars, the 11 or 12 stars, is imagery of this restored Israel. And so we have that imagery connected with this woman. We're also told that this woman is pregnant and that she's about to give birth. And so some scholars will see her as this restored Israel, so a symbol of the faithful community both before and after Christ, representing both the Old Covenant community and the New Covenant community. And she's in labor, and we're told that she has, if we skip down, that she's going to give birth to a son. And so this idea that the Messiah, the promised Messiah, the Messianic King, is going to come from this community of faith, this faithful, restored community. And so some scholars will hear Mary in this woman, and if you look at your books this week, they do a pretty good job of mentioning some of the different interpretations. Mary is one of them, but the faithful, restored Israel is another prominent interpretation of this woman. This woman is also portrayed as righteous, and this would be standing in contrast to the harlot who will show up in Revelation 17. So she's a faithful woman, a righteous woman. We also should hear echoes of Genesis 3 in this passage, especially as we get ready to talk about the dragon, but also images from Isaiah and talking about the woman about to give birth. So this imagery of a woman about to give birth, we see throughout scripture, especially in the Old Testament. And so it comes up here again. And we have then, but this vision is interrupted. The woman is interrupted by a vision of a dragon. So this woman is about to give birth, and then John sees another sign, and it's an enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on its head. And it has a tail that sweeps a third of the stars out of the sky, and they're flung to the earth. And the dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth so that it might devour her child the moment he was born. And so this image of the dragon. In the Old Testament, this image was used, the dragon image was used to represent evil kingdoms that were opposed to God and God's people. We also see images of Leviathan as like a sea monster, dragon, evil sea monster, also a symbol of evil oppressive kingdoms. And Egypt specifically is described in these terms. We're definitely meant to hear, though, that this dragon is representative of the devil himself. So the head of all evil, oppressive, terrible kingdoms who stand opposed to God and God's people. And we see him here waiting to devour the child that the woman is about to give birth to. This dragon is also described as having 7 heads with 10 horns and 7 crowns. And previously, we've talked about the number 7 representing completeness and wholeness and perfection. But what we can hear in this one, because this is definitely not a good image, but it is an image of complete oppression, of global domination, of impacting every area of the world. And so it's a picture of evil, and so it's the completeness of evil, and that's where we would how we would understand the numbers here. And we're told that this dragon is waiting to destroy the Messiah. He wants to devour the child the moment he is born, and destroy the Messiah, but also destroy God's people. And we're told, though, that she gave birth to a child who will rule all nations with an iron scepter, and that her child was snatched up to God and to his throne. And then the woman fled into the wilderness to a place prepared for her by God, where she might be taken care of for 1,260 days. So this period of time. So the dragon's plans to devour the woman's child are thwarted. And we know Jesus was snatched away at the resurrection. And that's how the kind of the imagery here. He was snatched away out of the clutches of Satan and his realm on earth. But Jesus is triumphant. And so we have that picture of that victory. And then what happens next in verses 7 through 12 is we have this picture of Michael and his angels. So the angel Michael and his angels fighting this war against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fighting back. But he's not strong the dragon is not strong enough, and they lose their place in heaven. This is very interesting because it says the great dragon was hurled down, that ancient serpent called the devil or Satan, who leads the whole world astray. He was hurled to the earth and his angels with him. So that picture of Satan's defeat, he's already been defeated. He is cast out of heaven down to earth. And this picture of him as the accuser is what we have here, the deceiver and the accuser. And one of the ways that we can understand this section is that there is this war in heaven, and it is almost the heavenly counterpart to what was happening on earth. So Michael is fighting in heaven, and Christ is fighting on earth, as it's kind of because Christ's life, death, and resurrection is the ultimate victory over Satan and over sin and over death. And then we see Satan being cast out. So he had been permitted to accuse, We see him accusing people. Job is what comes to mind for me. But now he's cast out. So just like he was cast out of the garden at the beginning of the new creation, now he is cast out at the beginning of creation. Now he is cast out at the beginning of the new creation. This part ends with this hymn. John hears a loud voice in heaven, most likely the voices of the saints, because they are talking in plural language, our God, and use that kind of language. But now have come the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Messiah. For the accuser of our brothers and sisters, who accuses them before our God day and night, has been hurled down. So he's no longer allowed to accuse. They triumphed over him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. They did not love their lives so much as to shrink from death. Therefore, rejoice, you heavens, and you who dwell in them. But woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil has gone down to you. He is filled with fury, because he knows that his time is short. So his time is limited. He's already been defeated. He's lost. But he still can wreak a bunch of havoc until before the end. So in some ways, we could say that his rampaging on the earth is a reflection of his defeat in heaven. And just a side note, I have been reading a commentary by G.K. Beale, and I've also been reading the materials that we have from our Revelation study by GC2 Press. And so that is where I am coming up with some of these interpretations and some of this information. It's not just out of my head. I just always want to throw that out there. I've done a lot of reading. And we come to the end of Revelation 12. And it concludes, it kind of picks back up the story of the dragon and the woman again in verse 13. And it says, the dragon saw he'd been hurled to earth, and he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. This is where I see the woman being representative of the church. And she is persecuted by Satan, but yet God protects her. And so it says the woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle so that she might fly to the place prepared for her in the wilderness, where she would be taken care of for a time, times, and half a time out of the serpent's reach. So we have this imagery of the woman being carried out into the wilderness to be protected by God. And we think about all the way back to the Exodus, the people are brought from Egypt out to the wilderness of Sinai, where they are protected by God. And yes, they ultimately choose not to enter the promised land and wander around. But initially, the wilderness is this place of protection from them, from the pursuing Egyptian army, and they are covered by the waters of the flood. But the Egyptian army is, but God protects them there. And we have imagery of God protecting his people with wings like eagles. Think about Isaiah 40 and some of those promises. And this presence of God being with his people is nourishing them in the wilderness and protecting them. It doesn't prevent the persecution of the church and of God's people, because we are still in this world. We still interact in this world. And we have this flood of water being spewed to overtake the woman and sweep her away, even though the earth intervenes and swallows up some of the water. There is still this work of Satan to deceive and to destroy. But ultimately, the church is protected by Christ's victory, that Satan has already been defeated. I think it's interesting because we really do get this sense of the dragon, of Satan being completely enraged by his defeat and really going on a rampage. And we're told here in verse 17, he was enraged at the woman and went off to wage war against the rest of her offspring, those who keep God's commands and hold fast their testimony about Jesus. So verse 17, though, is one of those interpretive cues or clues, if you will, that helps us to understand this section and really think about how Satan and his evil forces in this world really are at war with the church and with God's people. And we see that all throughout church history, on all the pages. Evil comes about, evil kingdoms and evil leaders and just persecution in general towards God and his people, or of God's people. One of the things that Beale said, and I'm going to look over my notes because I don't want to get it wrong, but this is a quote, and he says, the heavenly church, the one heavenly church being persecuted on earth cannot be destroyed because it's heavenly and ultimately inviolable spiritually. So it spiritually cannot be destroyed. But the many who individually compose the church can suffer physically. So the church itself, so the global universal church for all times and all eras of history, is not something that is destroyable, but we as members who make up that church, as people who make up that global universal church, do suffer the persecution and walk through earthly dangers and can feel those effects quite acutely and specifically, but yet we also can't be destroyed spiritually. But the church itself can't be destroyed by Satan and his evil forces. So as we conclude this section in Revelation 12, a couple things I wanted to leave us with is how are we nourished by God? We see here that the woman is protected in the wilderness where she'd be taken care of, and that taken care of by God. We've seen the people of Israel, if we go all the way back to the Exodus, and the time in the wilderness, God nourished them by manna from heaven. How are we nourished now by God? What does that look like for us? I think that's a helpful thing to kind of ponder, because we do see this hand of protection that God has on his people. But also, what is the evidence of the spiritual battle that we see around us? And let's keep that question kind of in the forefront of our mind as we step into Revelation 13, because we're going to see some crazy visions here and the beasts and all the things. So let's keep going. But what is that evidence of the spiritual battle that we see being waged around us? So John is seeing a vision here in Revelation 13, right on the heels of the previous one. And the dragon is standing on the shore of the sea, and he sees a beast come up out of the sea. And he describes this beast as having 10 horns and 7 heads and 10 crowns on its horns, and on each head a blasphemous name. So once again, a beast that is being described with the number 7 again, but this complete oppressive power with global impact is kind of how I would describe that. So it's not the number of completion like God in all of his perfection and completeness, but this idea of totality of destruction and oppression and impact. And what we see in this chapter is further details on Satan's persecution and battle against God's people. And we get a little insight, though in very figurative terms, about his agents that he uses to oppress God's people. And one other thing that's helpful is I would really encourage you to go and read through Daniel 7, because there are Daniel's visions of the beasts that he has in that part of Daniel. It kind of serves a lot as a background. There's a lot of crossover between Daniel and Revelation in general, but specifically Daniel 7 and his images or his visions of the beasts. So this beast from the sea is an agent of Satan, and he's called forth. This beast is called forth from the sea, which is often associated with the dwelling place of evil, of chaos. And there has been so much debate over who is this beast, this Antichrist figure. Really, from the earliest of church fathers, so early on in the church, people were debating, who is the Antichrist? Who is it going to be? Is it this person? Is it that person? What does this look like? And how are we to interpret this? Is this one specific person, or is this an evil spirit that we see kind of on all pages of history with evil regimes rising? And certainly we do see this cycle of evil in our world, where you have evil rulers and powers and all sorts of things happen that are terrible. But we also have this sense here that yes, there are antichrists, but there is also this really bad one, maybe the worst of the worst, that will be manifest at the end. And that's really what we hear John describing here. And this beast is described as a counterfeit Christ. And if you look for the clues, we almost see almost a parody of Christ's life and death and resurrection, with especially as we get it talks about the beast being slain and then rising and the authority that the beast has and the people who follow the beast. There's this final manifestation, kind of like second coming, if you will. And so this beast is very much an antichrist, a false counterfeit Christ. And he is shown to be this chief opponent of Christ, an agent of the devil. He is the one behind all of this. And certainly we see Satan at work throughout world history, church history, with many different figures in history. I'm sure if we were to pause here, we could name quite a few who were definitely opponents of Christ, of God and his people. But this still does leave open to interpretation. Well, who is that final, ultimate, ultra bad, terrible, worst of the worst, evil manifestation agent of Satan? Who is that going to be? And we don't know. We are not given nearly enough clues to know who this is on the pages of Revelation. We just know there's a person who is going to stand adamantly opposed to God and the worship of God, and stand adamantly opposed to God's people. John emphasizes the deception and the blasphemy and the exalting himself over God and the impact, the global impact that this person has. He describes how the people of the world worship this beast and that he is allowed to exercise his authority, this authority, for 42 months. And we're told in verse 7, he was given power to wage war against God's holy people and to conquer them. And it was given authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation. All inhabitants of the earth will worship the beast, all whose names have not been written in the Lamb's book of life. The Lamb who was slain from the creation of the world. And so we're reminded that that believers are kept safe. Christ's victory was a complete victory. We are kept safe because our names are recorded in the Lamb's book of life. And so we are spiritually not able to be destroyed by this beast. But John reminds those who are hearing this word in Revelation that this is going to be, he calls them to patient endurance and faithfulness, because it is not going to be easy to stand against this persecution. And then we start here in verse 11, and we have another vision, another beast. And John sees a second beast coming out of the earth. So the first beast was out of the sea. This one is out of the earth. And it is described as having two horns like a lamb, but it spoke like a dragon, or like the dragon. It exercised all the authority of the first beast on its behalf and made the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast whose fatal wound had been healed. So we see this beast from the earth being portrayed as a false prophet, one who is leading the people to worship the first beast. He's receiving his power from his connection to the first beast. He speaks with the voice of the dragon. So he is a counterfeit prophet. It says it performed great signs, causing fire to come down from heaven. So the performing great signs and calling fire from heaven. When we talked about the two witnesses, we talked about how they were reminiscent of Moses and Elijah. And once again here, we have Moses and Elijah performing signs like Moses did before Pharaoh, calling down fire from heaven like Elijah did. But a false prophet who is not receiving his power from the one true God like Moses and Elijah, but he's receiving his power from the beast and ultimately the dragon, which is Satan. And we're told that these signs and wonders that this false prophet is doing deceives the inhabitants of the earth. And this false prophet orders them to set up an image to honor the beast who was wounded by the sword and yet lived. Now, who does that sound like? Once again, takes us back to the book of Daniel. King Nebuchadnezzar, right? He builds this giant statue of himself and wants everyone to worship it. And if you don't worship it, you're going to be killed. You remember that story? Daniel's 3 friends get thrown in the furnace. There's a lot of similarities. We hear some similarities here. There have been a lot of King Nebuchadnezzars on the pages of world history. False prophet is describing the first beast in very similar terms. So they build this statue, this image of this first beast that is a substitute for God, and it's idolatry. It is substituting the truth of God for a lie. And then the second beast is given the power to give breath to the image of the first beast so that the image could speak and cause all who refuse to worship the image to be killed. Then this false prophet forces all people, great and small, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hands or on their foreheads, so that they could not buy or sell unless they had the mark, which is the name of the beast or the number of its name. Now, one of the things that is really interesting here is we think about the mark, that the seal that God places on the foreheads of his followers that we read about several chapters ago. And how it is his name, which we find out in chapter 14, really in verse 1 of chapter 14, and his father's name written on their foreheads, his name, and those are the name of the Lamb and the name of his father on their foreheads. And so this mark is a counterfeit to that. So it is a mark of loyalty and ultimate allegiance to the beast. And when we think about it, one of the things that Beale brought up in his commentary I thought was super fascinating. If you remember back in Exodus, when God gives the people the law, if you turn with me to Exodus 13 really quickly, look with me at verse 9. This observance, so he says, they talk about the consecration of the firstborn, and it said, this observance will be for you like a sign on your hand and a reminder on your forehead that the law of the Lord is to be on your lips. For the Lord brought you out of Egypt with his mighty hand, and you must keep this ordinance at the appointed time, year after year. And we see this call for God's people to remember what God has done for them by putting a mark on their forehead or on their hand. And it's supposed to be a sign for them that they belong to God, but also that they are to follow God and his ways and do life in his way. And this mark of the beast is completely opposite that. So when we think about the mark on the forehead being a mark that says that I agree and I ideologically commit to this way of doing things, but then a mark on the hand meaning the doing of that commitment. Because we do the things with our hands, and we commit to things in our heads and our hearts. So we see this false prophet tricking the people of the world into that kind of allegiance to the beast. And so we have this mark placed on their forehead or on their hand that shows their complete and total allegiance, their complete identification with the beast. And this would make or will make it very difficult for the people of God to do life. So to do the very simple things of life, such as buying and selling and participating in their culture. And we see this throughout church history, but specifically during the Roman times, it was very difficult for Christians to participate in normal everyday life without coming into contact with idol worship or being forced to think about, okay, if I buy this meat or if I do this thing, am I going to be condoning the worship of this pagan deity? And it was very difficult in many ways for them to participate in the world just doing normal life things. And so I think that's one of the things that kind of stands out to me here is that this mark of the beast does the same kind of thing. Makes it hard for the people of God to just live normal life without coming right up against and being almost forced to toe the line or cross the line of idolatry, rubbing up against the idolatry of the world. And that brings a question of how do we experience that pressure of idolatry today? Now, there's not a temple necessarily down at the end of our street or in the center of our city, but how are we rubbing shoulders with the idolatry of our day? And what does the idolatry of our day look like? Because it doesn't always look like another religion. Sure, it does. There are other religions who worship idols. But I would say in our culture, a lot of times that's not what it looks like. Those are the easy ones to spot whenever it is another religion. Sometimes the things that are kind of woven into the fabric of our everyday lives that have risen to that place of prominent place of like on the throne of our heart kind of place, sometimes those are a little sneakier to figure out. What are those things in our culture that tempt us to do that, to replace God in his rightful place as Lord of our life? So that's one of the questions that this section brings up. And I haven't forgotten the last verse with the number 666, but I wanted to bring up the conversation about idolatry first, because I think that is one of the applications we can take from this vision of this false prophet and this beast. But John concludes this section with verse 18. This calls for wisdom. Let the person who has insight calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. That number is 666. Now, there have been many, many pages and ink spilled trying to figure out this number and who this number is referring to. But it is very difficult to figure out what this number or who this number is specifically referring to. I think one of the most compelling interpretations I have heard of the number 666 is whereas the sets of 7 indicate this completeness and this wholeness, especially that when we're talking about God and the 7s that we see associated with God and the things of God on the pages of Revelation. The triple sixes kind of stand in contrast to that. So a symbol of incompleteness, of imperfection. So that's why it would be the symbol or the number of humanity, of humans. And I think one of the things that many people have done, they try to use the numbers and figure out like how do the numbers correspond to letters of people's names and trying to figure out who does this number refer to throughout history. And I'm sure the internet is full of people telling you they've figured it out. But ultimately, what scripture tells us, and John doesn't really give us the indication that he's using the number to refer to a specific person. He doesn't tell us what language we need to be translating the numbers into. I mean, people have wondered if it's Hebrew or Greek or even Latin, but he doesn't give us really a whole lot to go on. But what he does give us to go on is we have the sets of 7 that indicate the completeness and wholeness and perfection of God. And we have the sets of 6 that the 6 here, that is the indication of the imperfection and the incompletion of humanity without Christ. Because we need Christ's life, death, and resurrection to make us whole and complete. So I know that was quite a quick walk through Revelation 12 and 13. And there probably are many things I did not answer to your satisfaction or even mine, quite frankly, because there are so many things in Revelation in general. But I hope this kind of gives you a little bit of a whet your appetite a little bit. There's plenty more you can read. If you want to read more, I'd be happy to give you some resources. I have a couple places I could direct you. But next week, we will continue forward in this vision and we'll be stepping into Revelation 14. I'll see you then. Bye.